I'm very excited for today's session. We have two fantastic guest speakers. We have Laura Goodwin from Namati and Zahara Khalid from the Nubian Rights Forum. I'm not going to tell you too much about them because I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. But I think this is going to be a really key, a different way of looking at digital identity. We often think about it as being, and we know it is such a crucial step for people to access digital financial services, which is the focus for the majority of us participants on this call. But actually hearing a little bit more about how we can make digital identity inclusive and make sure that what we're trying to strive to do doesn't accidentally exclude some people. I think that's going to be really, really interesting to hear about that. So just a quick reminder before we launch into the session, we've got the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for Laura and Zahara, please use the Q&A function and we'll ask them once they've had a chance to go through their presentation. And we're also recording the session today as well. So if you really enjoy it or your internet connection maybe drops you off, don't worry, we'll be sending a recording through to everybody tomorrow as well. And you can share that with hopefully your colleagues and friends so that more and more people can hear this great webinar and also learn about the work of Namati and the Nubian Rights Forum. So that's it from my side. Welcome everybody. It's so nice to see you all, and thank you so much to Laura and Zahara for spending an hour with us today. And I'm going to hand over to you both.
Great, thank you so much for having us. We're really glad to be here to share some of our experiences and then engage with you all around issues of inclusion. My name is Laura Goodwin. I work with Namati, which is a legal empowerment organization, helping people know, use, and shape the law. And I direct our citizenship program, which is focusing on working with marginalized communities to access proof of legal identity.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zahara Khalid. I work with the Nubian Rights Forum, a community-based organization in Nairobi, Kibera, championing for the rights of the minority living in that village. And mostly we engage in citizenship, gender-based violence, and other rights for the minority communities in my village. Thank you.
So today we're, as Sarah said, we're going to be talking about inclusion and digital identity, primarily looking at Kenya's Huduma number as an example. So in terms of what we hope to share today, we'll start with some challenges in Kenya's current identification system and what that looks like. Then talk about Huduma number and risks of exclusion as Kenya is transitioning towards this new digital ID. Then legal empowerment approaches to identification and some of our experience in that area and how we've built on that in terms of the response to Huduma number. But we thought we'd start with a story about one of the community members that we've been working with.
Well, this person you see on your screen, his name is Ahmed Khalil Kafe. He is a Nubian residing in Kibera, Nairobi, Kenya. Ahmed Khalil is a Kenyan citizen, born and bred in Nairobi, Kenya. Since he is 72 years old, and he was among the first soldiers to be employed by the Kenya government. Ahmed Khalil Kafe got his ID after finishing school. That was in 1965. Then he was 18 years. He was then employed by the Kenya Police Force in the same year. He worked until 1972, whereby he was laid off due to disciplinary action by the government. Ahmed had all his documentation. He had his ID, he had his police service number, he had his police ID card, and also he had his driving license. But after being laid off, Ahmed Khalil's document got lost. After his documents being stolen from his house, Ahmed embarked on the normal procedure, which was to go to the police and obtain a police abstract of the said document. Then he would wait for the government agency to produce his ID. At that time, that was the first generation ID of Kenya. Ahmed waited for several months for his ID to be produced, but unfortunately, every time he used to go to the government agencies, no substantive answer was given to him. All he was told was that his document was not ready. When he lost these documents, Ahmed had no copies of them, except his police service number. We would ask ourselves, why only his police service number? Because when you're employed by the Kenya government and you're a police, the only number which matters to you most is your police service number. So what is in Ahmed's mind is not even his ID number, but his police service number. At this point, after being taken round and round, Ahmed lost hope. He gave up trying to look for his identification card because he kept being pushed around in circles by the registration officers. In 2014, Ahmed suffered a stroke. But because of lack of documentation, Ahmed could not obtain a medical cover, which could then pay for his medical expenses. Ahmed had to rely on well-wishers to pay his medical bills. It was not a minor illness. Stroke is an illness that is huge in nature. With lack of ID, because in Kenya you need an ID to apply for majorly all documents, be it your insurance, your passport, any other subsequent documents requires an ID. Also, without this crucial document called an ID, he also missed opportunities like enjoying the elderly benefits that people of his age get. Anyone above the age of 71 years would get stipends from the government, but Ahmed is not qualified because he has no ID and you need to present yourself to the government with the ID to say that you should enjoy this benefit. Though, when you look at Ahmed, by face, you judge that he requires and deserves this benefit. But because he doesn't have any documentation, he is locked out of this benefit. Another crucial benefit that Ahmed does not enjoy is charity by non-governmental organizations, because local organizations that are tasked to undertake this charity to the local people require an ID for verification purposes and also for accountability. So here we see that lack of this crucial document makes him vulnerable and lack several opportunities. At this point, in 2014, when we were brought as NRF, a well-wisher came to our offices and told us of Ahmed's plight of not getting an ID. And since the well-wisher knew that we handle and we try to assist people to get the ID, they brought Ahmed's story to us. That's when we as an office decided to take up his case and try to see why is Ahmed for all those years, 26 years, why hasn't he been given his ID? Yet he was a civil servant. So we took up the matter, we walked, then he was not able to walk because he was ill. So we took his documentation and started following up with the registrar, with the local registrar. But they required Ahmed to be there for them to take his fingerprints and also present himself to be able to swear an affidavit. We did that severally, and Ahmed was booked for a vetting, but Ahmed was not allowed to undertake any vetting. Every now we ask why is it that they don't put Ahmed in the vetting list. They tell us that they are waiting for such results from the head office. But every time we go there, we did not lose hope as an organization. We went there back and forth several times, but the minute we go there the following time, we are told either Ahmed's documents are lost or we need to start the process afresh. I would ask my colleague, Laura, to continue as I will proceed with Ahmed's story later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So Ahmed's plight, not having an ID for so many years and being unable to navigate the system, he's not the only Kenyan who faces these kinds of challenges. In Kenya, we estimate around 5 million citizens are actually subjected to a different process called vetting when they apply for an ID card. And this is based on either their ethnicity or their religious affiliation. So even when they show up with the same documents to apply as any other Kenyan, they're told to go to a different line. So not everyone's process is as long as Ahmed's, but if you're a Kenyan who's part of the Nubian community, the Somali community, the Swahili community, or many others, you're sent to this different line. You must produce a different set of documents, including sometimes grandparents' IDs or grandparents' birth certificates, which almost no one has, and answer almost any question that the registrar feels like asking that day. There's a lot of discretion in the process. As a result, for these groups, getting an ID can take months or years longer than other Kenyans, and some are unable to get an ID at all. This really happens in many places around the world, that certain groups are subjected to arbitrary requests, unchecked discretion, and unequal treatment in processes of obtaining identification. Discrimination is a major barrier in access to proof of identity, whether it's a widespread policy like Kenya's two-tiered system, or whether it's the bias of an individual registration agent on the ground. So given this context, what happens when a country like Kenya shifts towards a new national digital identity system? In our view, it's very critical to take into account the practical realities of what's happening on the ground and what's happening in current systems, as without addressing these kinds of challenges, the challenges that Ahmed is facing, through full reform, this process of shifting to digital identity could actually exacerbate exclusion. We see this transition to digital identity as an opportunity where reform could happen, where things could change. But too often it results in a country layering a new system on top of a deeply unequal and exclusionary foundation, leading to exclusion for many people. So taking Kenya as an example of what does this look like? In early 2019, Kenya established what's called NIMS, the National Integrated Identity Management System, under which a unique identifier is to be issued to every Kenyan citizen and every resident of Kenya. And that unique identifier is called Huduma Namba, which in Swahili is service number. So this new system is supposed to create a centralized database, compiling information not only on identity, replacing the current ID card, but also linking together your tax information, your social security information, the National Hospital Insurance Fund, your driving license information, and so many other aspects of your life, putting everything into a single number and a single card. So as as the government started to move towards this system early last year, they moved very quickly. So they used an amendment law to establish a system, and just 3 weeks later had pilot registration going on the ground, and a few weeks after that, a nationwide mass registration campaign to try to encourage people to sign up for this new Huduma number. In the meantime, litigation, which Zara will talk more about, also started in order to challenge the system and what it would mean for Kenyans. Some of the concerns that were raised at that point included, why is it possible to use a miscellaneous amendments bill to establish a system that is so far-reaching in terms of how it would impact people's lives? Also, the lack of public participation in either the law or the system, the lack of a data protection framework to govern how the data would be stored and used, and finally, the risk of exclusion in the system. So using Huduma number as an example, I want to look a little bit at how exclusion can take place in the transition to digital identity. And so although we're looking specifically at Kenya today, this is just an example because I think a lot of the ways that exclusion may happen here are similar to the ways that these things can play out in other places as well. So I think with identification and especially digital identity, exclusion is often looked at in terms of the coverage of the system. Is someone able to enroll or not? Are they included or not? But I'd like to look at a couple of different points of exclusion in an ID system. The first being enrollment, the second being data verification, and the third being use, including a couple of different elements. So for Huduma number enrollment, the Huduma number system is supposed to cover all Kenyan citizens and all foreign residents in the country. So on the surface or on paper, it seems like the system is inclusive. It's supposed to cover everyone. But in order to enroll, you have to have a document already, either an ID card for an adult or a birth certificate for a child. And what we saw during mass registration last year, even adults with birth certificates but no ID were turned away from registration. So at that time, those who tried to apply without documents were often told, well, go apply for your ID, get it, and come back. And so for some people, that's possible. They can apply for an ID and 3 or 4 weeks later, they have it in hand. But for people like Ahmed or people from these communities that we work with, they may need to wait 6 months, a year, 2 years, or even longer to get their ID. And so they were really shut out of the enrollment process. So I think in particular, this direct connection between the current identification system and the new digital system without reform is just bringing those flaws into the new system as well. At the same time, apart from communities that face discrimination, there are also people who may be far from the nearest registration center, who don't have the financial means to be able to pay for the transport to go there and back several times, and also lack of awareness that may mean, especially in rural areas and remote areas, there's also many people who lack any kind of documentation and thus are unable to enroll in Huduma number. At the same time, the stakes of being able to access this number are increasing because proving who you are is becoming a requirement for more and more rights and services. So it's great for those who are able to get the number, but those who aren't are locked out of a greater number of opportunities. Second, looking at the data verification process. So the government has said many times, people come to apply for Huduma number, and then they'll compare the data that's provided during registration and the data that the government has on hand to know whether or not to issue the number to this person. So there are a couple of ways that exclusion can also manifest in this process. So as we know, in practice, to enroll in Huduma number, you needed an ID card or a birth certificate. At the same time, in the training manual for the registration agents who are doing this registration on the ground, there was an option. It said, if the applicant doesn't have an ID card, you can put XX in the field for ID number and still enroll them. So we know in most cases this wasn't followed, but if it was, what could be the implications for that applicant? So first, thinking about nationality. So Kenya's Huduma number is linked to nationality in that there'll be a different card issued to Kenyan citizens versus foreign residents. Some identity systems are more residency based in that everyone gets the same kind of number or card, but here it is linked to nationality. So we don't know if someone was registered with XX in their ID card as their ID card number, will that affect any kind of treatment of their application, either by a data processor in terms of a person or in terms of the way the system is set up in terms of algorithms, in terms of their nationality. So could it mean that XX delays the issuance of their number? Does that mean that the field for nationality would remain blank? There's things that we don't know about this process, but there are ways that this process could put people's nationality rights at risk, excluding them from citizenship itself. And then apart from nationality, in general, what happens if a person's information that they provided during the registration doesn't match what the government has on hand, which they've said themselves is messy and incomplete data? And what data has to match in order for someone to receive a Huduma number? Here we can see the wide range of data that was collected from each individual. Everything from disability status to spouse's ID to whether or not you own land used for agricultural purposes. So what needs to match to receive a Huduma number, and what happens if your data doesn't match? Where does the burden of proof lie? Is the government's messy data more valid or more weighty than what an individual is saying about themselves? Or what kinds of delays might this cause that could impact people's ability to access services? And which groups in the country might be most affected? So again, we don't know the answers to these questions because there's been almost no transparency around the process or decision-making in terms of data verification. But it's very possible that even people who could complete the enrollment process may have issues of exclusion later down the line as the data is actually processed. So then in terms of use, so at the moment, no one has actually received the Huduma number yet. The data is still being processed and the court case is still ongoing. But we can look to other places and potentially project what other issues may happen once these numbers are in use. So first is a more human element. Is if someone has a Huduma card, they go to a point of service, is that person's ID number or ID card accepted on an equal basis as everyone else? We know that sometimes people do have identification in hand, but when they're trying to use it, they're told often on the basis of their name or their gender or their address, it reveals something about who they are and their identity that could trigger to bias. And so even with this digital system, there's often a human element of saying your ID card is not valid enough, or I'm not going to let you even continue with the process of verifying who you are, you're not eligible, or the system is down today, or any other excuse that could keep people from accessing services. And we see that even now with this vetting process, in the communities where we work, people go through this vetting process, they get an ID. Then if they use that ID to go get a passport, they're vetted again. And when their children turn 18 and apply for an ID, even with the parent's ID in hand, they're also vetted. So it's a question of why is this person's ID card not accepted as much as the other? The other piece is the technological element, issues with authentication. And so this could happen to anyone, but if the server is down, if there's a connectivity problem, especially in certain parts of the country, or if there's a biometric failure, especially that could affect people who have been involved in manual labor or who have different kinds of skin ailments that may affect their fingerprints, there could also be an issue where you've enrolled, your data has been processed, you have this number, but there's some reason again why you may not be able to actually access services in an inclusive way. So I want to offer a couple of ideas of potential policy or practice solutions. We feel like, especially in the case of Kenya, there should be an option to allow a greater range of options for supporting documents at the point of application. Why can't an adult use a birth certificate and enroll? With a broader range of documents, it's more likely someone would have at least one of them, and therefore that would help promote inclusion rather than requiring a narrow range that may lock many people out. As well, many countries have used what's called an introducer system, where a community leader or an administrator or other trusted person, usually defined in law, can vouch for the identity of someone who lacks documentation so that they can still enroll into the system despite knowing that many people in a country may not be in a position where they have documentation to show. Obviously, that would require regulations and ensuring that someone who does register with a document versus an introducer are treated the same way by the system, but that could be another option to open up more inclusive enrollment. Both for enrollment and use, multiple forms of identification can also be useful, especially around the question, what is it that someone needs to prove to access the service that you're offering? Maybe it's just who they are, maybe it's their age, maybe it's their citizenship, and that they may be able to prove that in many different ways, rather than just having to use one number or one ID card. One example that I really like of this is the US I-9 form. So anyone who has worked in the US is probably familiar with this form. So when you accept employment in the US, you need to prove your identity and that you're authorized to work in the country. And so this form actually lists out explicitly the documents that prove both. And so you could produce one of those, or you can produce one document that shows your identity and one document that establishes you can work in the country. And this really proves what you need to prove in order to continue with employment. And so I like that this is so explicit and allows for really a range of different documents to be used to access employment, or, in another scenario, to access a service, rather than saying you must have this one single number in order to move forward. So a few other safeguards that could be useful based on these points of exclusion could be more transparency around data verification, including some kind of appeals process that's easily accessible and easy to navigate, some kind of manual or backup form of authentication. So if the server is down or there's a connectivity problem in a health clinic or at a school or at a place providing food rations, there's a way to manually still issue the service even when it's not possible to link to the system. And then also in general, grievance redress mechanisms should any of these things break down. So before I turn it over to Zara, I think one conclusion that we have is that in order to build on top of identification, whether it's with cash transfers, whether it's with digital payments, whether it's with many other forms of services and transactions, there can't be an assumption that a functioning and inclusive identification system just exists. It's something that takes a lot of intention in terms of creating and maintaining. And so that's really important in terms of thinking about how these other kinds of services can benefit people. Similarly, legal and policy safeguards alone are not enough. What if someone doesn't know that they have an option to use more than one kind of identification? Or what if someone is denied a service, but a grievance redress mechanism isn't working? So one other solution that can cut across these different points of exclusion is community-based efforts that empower people to know, use, and shape the laws that affect them. So now I'll turn it over to Zara, who will speak to how these legal empowerment programs work and how we've built on some of these approaches in terms of the community response to Huduma number in Kenya.
Thanks, Laura. I introduced myself as a paralegal. So before I proceed, I want you to get to know who's a paralegal, what we do. Yeah, so a paralegal in our context refers to community-based non-lawyers who use knowledge of law and skills to empower community and advocacy to seek accessible solutions to instances of injustice. What do we do as paralegals in our area of work? What we do is we accompany clients in navigating through administrative and judicial processes and spread knowledge in layman, in language that common people can understand. By this, what do we mean? We want us as paralegals to understand the law first, and then we teach this law that we've understood to our community members so that they can also know this law. And we want to use this law. We want our community and ourselves to use this law to empower all of us so that we can be a community that is empowered legally. We do this through several outreaches strategies, such as community forums, door-to-door visits, radio shows, visit to government offices, school and hospital visits, and sometimes Chief's Baraza. Chief's Baraza is whereby the local administration call for a meeting with community members. So we take this opportunity to go and empower the community. How do we track our clients' cases or database? We use summary sheets, case summary sheets, and we have an online cloud database known as Salesforce, whereby once a client comes to our offices, we take the case and then we track it by the use of Salesforce. On the screen, Laura has depicted some of the statistics that Salesforce would give us. You would see that there is different variances, like normal application at what age. In Kenya, one is presumed an adult once they reach 18. So you'd see that how many people go to government offices when they turn 18. How many late applications do we have? By late, we mean anyone who's, the law says that anyone above 18 plus 9 months, that application is known as and termed as a late application. So, and first you see the case of Nubian applicants from 2013 to 2014. And then the other one. This is just a simple what Salesforce depicts. Government introduced a digital ID system known as NIMS, which Laura was talking about, which was supposed to register all Kenyan citizens and foreign nationals living in Kenya through its project known as Huduma Namba. Huduma is a Swahili word simply meaning service. So here government is trying to peg a certain number into services. That is, on onset, we have a problem with that. Why should you peg a registration to service? Because meaning those who will not be registered will not have this service. The Huduma Namba project was an opportunity to address systemic discrimination so that we can go into a non-discriminatory system, which we all thought was what was supposed to happen. But unfortunately, for as Nubians and other minority communities, people who go through a lot of vigorous ID application processes, and it takes some time for them to get this, you had to have an ID to be enrolled into this system. With this, the system was not coming to help the old system. In any case, it was further marginalizing the minority community. We started by telling you the story of Ahmed Khalil. Ahmed Khalil went to the registration assistance. Hereby, this is when Huduma Namba was launched. He saw it as an opportunity. I've been denied an ID. Now there's this new registration system. Why don't I take my chances? So Ahmed Khalil went to the registering clerks and presented himself and said that he wanted to register for Huduma Namba. Woe unto him. The system does not allow anyone who has if you're an adult, you don't have an ID, you'll not be registered. And if you're a minor, you don't have a birth certificate, you'll not be registered. Yet the narrative that the government was putting out there is that any government document can make you be eligible to admission into the system. That was a lie, because Ahmed knew his service number. Because if you can key in a service number, former civil servant, meaning his data is with the government. But unfortunately, he was denied entry into the Huduma Namba system. Remember that he has tried to apply for his ID card for the past 26 years. After Ahmed's plight of being locked out of Huduma Namba registration, we saw it fit as Nubian Rights Forum to go to court and try to seek redress, because it's not only Ahmed that is going through this predicament. We have several more other clients, not only in Kibera, but in the coastal region, we have minority communities. In Northeastern, we have minority communities who are locked, or if you don't, you will not get an ID until you go through vetting. Other communities have to wait for a year, 2 years for you to be vetted. Here, you see that these people who will not have ID will be locked out. So what's the use of this system that is taking up the errors of the past system? We're not solving anything. The paralegals went through the loopholes in the Miscellaneous Amendment Bill. Laura talked about this because NIMS is anchored under this bill, and embarked on empowering our communities, because we know without being empowered legally, by knowing what the law says, the government can abuse its own citizens. And until when you are empowered is when you can ask for your rights and demand for your rights as a citizen. So we saw it fit that we need first to empower our community members through several community forums. And before going to court, because we were going to court for the community, why should they be locked out of a system, yet the system says that it's going to register all Kenyan citizens and foreign nationals living in Kenya? So when we decided that we want to go to court, we saw it fit that it's a must to include our community. The members must be actively involved into this court process. It's not just a lawyers, judges process. We saw it fit that they should be involved. As you can see on your screens that Laura has put there clearly, you can see the members of the community. We used to go with them to the court session because we wanted them to hear, not for us to go back to them and tell them, this is what happened into the court. No, we wanted them to first-hand listen to what was happening, all the proceedings, and even Ahmed Khalil was one of the co-witnesses we had. Before going to court, we hold community forums with our community members, and we give them brief of our pleas. What do we want? And also we wanted to ask them, what do they want? What do they expect from the court? So that with that, we incorporate their views into all the court proceedings. After the hearing, we hold another community forum to explain to the community. All of us know that while in the courtroom, the legal jargon is what is used. And not all our community members would understand what is being said. So we hold a community forum for like doing a debrief, explaining to them in a language that they can understand best, so that they get to feel that they're part and parcel of this process. Amidst our court hearings, the government decided to hold a public participation on Huduma bill, a bill that was not there prior. They came up with this bill after we had taken them to court and raised the issue of why do you need to bring in a law that affects everybody with a miscellaneous amendment bill. We all know miscellaneous amendment bills are used to make minor corrections on several acts. But our government used that opportunity to pass in Huduma number. It's another thing that took us to court. They hold public participation on Huduma bill, and due to the skills and empowerment level that the community acquired during our forums, they requested us if we could facilitate for them to go to the public participation and present their written memorandum. Remember, before we started with the legal empowerment, they could not come up with such a request, or even say that they want to petition government or a ministry. So here, after we see the fruits of our community forum and the legal empowerment that, hey, our community is requesting for us, they want to present their own memorandum. So we saw it as a challenge for us, and we were grateful. And also we saw that our legal empowerment, empowering the community, was bearing fruits. Because without this, we had never heard of such that one of the members, either of the members, wants to present a memorandum to the government. Indeed, they went to the forum where majority of the participants were government officials. On the picture that you see on your screens, when we went there, the room looked intimidating because it was a big hall, yes, but no, the participants were very few. I think it was by design or choice that, one, the location of the public participation was far away in outskirts of Nairobi. And yet you're terming that you're holding the community forum in Nairobi. In that location, no public vehicle can access it because majorly private vehicles are the ones which pass through that road. We, as an organization, when we facilitated for the community to go there, we got lost several times ourselves. So imagine a common person not knowing where to go, not knowing where this government institution is at. So when they went there, they were happy that they reached there, or they were like, yeah, we've reached here. So they presented their written memorandum, and in public, when they were given chance to speak, they questioned the reason as to why the forum was held in such a place. As I conclude, with the rollout of Huduma number registration, when I said Ahmed decided to go and present himself to register for Huduma Namba, but he was turned away due to lack of ID, an interesting turn of events occurred. When Ahmed Khalil was supposed to testify in court against the government for denying him, one, his ID, and also locking him out of the Huduma Namba registration, the Kibra local registrar called Ahmed on his personal number and told him to go to their offices. This is prior to Ahmed's testimony. So when he went there, he was vetted, he was allowed to apply for the document, and he was given a waiting card on 5th of September 2019. That was before Ahmed's testimony. Why, you would ask yourself, it's a question that is out there. But for us, we thought this is a way of luring Ahmed in Ahmed not testifying so much against them. While normally one waits up to 3 weeks to get their identification cards, a year later, Ahmed is still waiting for his ID. The government keeps telling him his ID is not ready. As an organization, we are not against digital ID system. But what we want is for the system to be all-inclusive, as they had put it by design, and not to leave anyone behind. By not leaving anyone behind, the minority indigenous communities in Kenya should not be left out. Even if they don't have documentation, as Laura had put, that there should be certain mechanism of how to allow them into the system. But currently, as the system is, it is designed to exclude this minority indigenous community. Another request that you can have is that we need the public and the marginalized communities to be involved in the design of laws and system, because as it is, then the public is not involved. We are always left behind. We also need to ensure discrimination and exclusion is eliminated in the process of transitioning to digital ID, not entrenched. Civil society has an essential role in outreach and involvement of vulnerable communities, supporting people to obtain concrete solution, that is through documentation, and monitoring the process to show what's working and what needs improvement. That's what I will conclude with. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you for bringing it to life with the story of Ahmed. Like when you see a real person who's been going through these struggles, somehow it does resonate with you. It certainly did with me, and the way you've explained some of the challenges and issues, I had an understanding, but the way you've explained it has made it much clearer for me to understand, you know, all the different steps involved and how that has accumulated to cause this exclusion, some challenges for some people. So thank you very much for taking the time to share that with us. And all of our attendees, please start posting your questions that you have to Laura and Zara in the Q&A function. We have one that's come in from Oswell, who was sort of asking, you know, why was this kind of new ID kind of concept brought in? Wouldn't it have been better to sort of use the existing national identity that was in place before? What made do you know what the decisions or the policies might have been behind wanting to bring in something sort of different like the Huduma number?
Thanks for that question. I think we agree. Given the number of flaws in the existing identification system, it seems like from our view at least, it would have been better to invest in improving this system, making it more inclusive, and we're needing to make it more modern or digitized as well to do that, rather than put this entire new system in place that really does link everything together and raise the stakes. I think the government has used a lot of different rationales for the system at different times. They've talked about efficient service delivery. They've talked about national security, about like development planning and knowing who is where. But none of those rationales have really been explained in detail, I would say, by government. Like they've not explained with this new number, how does that lead to more efficient or better services for people? And so I think there are a lot of questions about what the motivations are, as well as why the system was so rushed. Why not say, as a country, we want to move in this direction, let's have a national conversation about what that means and what we need and what that looks like, and design it in a way that works for people, rather than rushing something out without a really strong legal basis, without a lot of piloting or public participation. So I think that there could have been many ways to improve the process of how this is happening.
And we've got another question that's come in from Angela. So how does Huduma number reconcile with the integrated population registration services data on citizens and non-citizens? And I think that's an interesting question, because as she was saying, banks are making use of that data to conduct KYC, which has really helped. So I mean, obviously, having a good, strong ID system really helps with adding on, like you said, layering on other things such as financial services. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that from Angela.
Sure. So I do think that the IPRS system has been important in terms of being able to do some of those verifications and linkages. It seems like from what we know, the government feels like it didn't go far enough, or that there were more aspects of that system that they wanted to put in place. And so they wanted to put something a little bit more comprehensive in place in terms of Huduma number. But I think, again, there hasn't been enough public explanation of how does IPRS work. Now, if there are deficiencies, what are the deficiencies from the government's view, and how does Huduma number fix those? It just seems like they put this initial system in place and now they want to upgrade to a more comprehensive version. And so I do think that something like this could be useful for KYC and for other processes. But if millions of Kenyans are left out, it will be useful for some and there'll be a big gap for others.
And it's often the same people that were excluded before that continue to be excluded. So it's not true inclusion. It's not really bringing everybody into the realm of digital financial services, which is at the heart what so many of our digital finance community really want to see. So it's a shame. We have another really good question from Dennis coming in. He just wants to know what is the outcome, or of the public hearing. How are things progressing with the legal case?
Sorry, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. The hearings were concluded in the High Court, and the government was ordered by the court to put down clear regulations that would define how the system would be taken through. But we were not satisfied by all the directions given by the court. So we are now at the courts of appeal, appealing the decision by the courts, because aspects of discrimination and aspects of the system being not sufficient for everybody was not tackled as we would have liked it to be tackled. Thank you.
And I think, Zara, there's a good kind of follow-up question to that one. What was written about Huduma number and its kind of aim, I think we can all look, as Dennis is saying, it seems like it was coming from a very good place, and we all know the importance of digital identity. He's just sort of saying, what would be the best strategy? So, if there are certain areas or certain groups that perhaps, this vetting, is affecting, what would be other ways to do that other than vetting that, from your perspective? How could it be better managed?
one of the recommendations that we had given government is try to solve the identity, the citizenship identity of its citizen from birth. When kids are born, give them their nationality at that point. Don't wait for the kids to reach 18 and then you start telling them, oh, we are trying to analyze if you're Kenyan or you're not Kenyan. So I have a Kenyan birth certificate, and then yet here I'm going to present myself to apply for an ID. You tell me I'm not a Kenyan. And you had given me a Kenyan birth certificate stating that I'm a Kenyan. So for us, give Kenyan nationality at birth for everybody so that this aspect of a certain community going through vetting is eliminated, because children born within the Kenyan border territories would be their citizenship would be determined at that particular time. And again, for those who are already into the system, because government is very, very creepy. At the top, they say that the local administration, who's the chief, if the chief can identify you and vouch that you're a Kenyan, you should be allowed to apply for this document. But that's not what's happening on the ground. The chief, yes, wouldn't identify you, but you go ahead and be vetted by other government operatives. So as Laura had said, for these indigenous minority communities, if there can be somebody who's trusted by the government themselves and they vouch for these people, they should be allowed to apply for this documentation. Thank you.
And as you were talking there, and also when Laura was talking, it reminded me like DFI has organized what we're calling Digital Identity Week, the first week of November. And this is a chance for all of our community to kind of come together, to hear from experts, such as people like yourselves that are working on, these kind of issues. But we're also working on a live case study as part of that week. So a chance for peer-to-peer learning, people coming up with ideas and suggestions and views and opinions. And actually our case study is based on Eswatini, and we are discussing, how the chief systems in Eswatini can help with improving access to digital identity within the country. So it's really great to see that something that you're recommending is actually something that Eswatini are considering, and our DFI community, and both of you would be, really, really welcome to join that discussion. It would be fantastic to start to put some ideas together for the country so that they can use that method and use it reliably and efficiently and safely. So that's really exciting. That I'm glad I kind of put those two things together. So thanks for that. And I'm definitely going to make sure you join those conversations with us, because I think you've got a lot of expertise to share there. So we've got another couple of questions, which I'm going to try and squeeze in as many as we can before we finish today. Faith is asking, so obviously Zara, you're from Nubian Rights Forum, you're advocating on behalf of that community. Are there other communities also advocating for their communities in this process, or are you also expanding to any community that's affected?
Actually, when we went to the court, we were not only speaking in regards to the Nubian community alone. Here we were presenting a case for anyone who will be locked out by the system. The Nubian was just a case study. But we were really, when the judgment would come out, you'd see that the judgment will affect the whole country, not Nubians per se alone. Any community who's been locked out by the system, if we get a positive judgment, it will affect all of us. So we just put a Nubian just as a face and as a case study, because it's what we have. And we have other partner organizations, like in Mombasa, we have Haki Center who are fighting for the rights of the, what do we call them, Laura?
In the coast.
Yes.
Both the Swahili population, but also Pemba and Makonde, other communities that have struggled with nationality.
Yeah, those ones that are at risk of being stateless. They are actually stateless community. They are called a stateless community. So And also we have a partner organization in Wajir and also in Garissa, who are working hand in hand with us to try to end discrimination. And if there is any other community, we as the Nubian Rights Forum are willing to partner with any organization with the help of Namati, because they are our parent, they are like our parent partner. So we don't discriminate on, because we are discriminated upon ourselves. So we can't discriminate upon any other community. If it will be of interest to know is that in Kibra, we don't only work with Nubians, we work with all the communities that are around living in Kibra. Majority who are not Nubians, majority are non-Nubians. So we help anyone who comes to our offices, regardless of their community.
Thank you. And it's amazing to see the impact of your work. Like you say, having people wanting to present at a government forum, going from probably not even knowing those things exist to having the ability, the passion, and the drive to stand up and present. I mean, how amazing is that? Well done. And our last two questions are very similar, so I'm going to kind of combine them from Yadana and also from Dennis. So I think sort of they both asking, how did this vetting process, or how does citizenship work? Like, obviously we're just perhaps missing a little bit of the history. What went on perhaps in that? Would it help us understand why vetting was introduced in the first place and some of the challenges with citizenship?
Sure. So in general, I would say there's two aspects of citizenship important in Kenya. One is the year 1963, when Kenya became independent. The Constitution says if you were in the country at that time, you were a citizen. And so in addition to that, the law says if at the time of your birth, either your father or your mother, which is before 2010, it was your father only. But if at the time of your birth, your father or mother is Kenyan, you're also Kenyan by birth. So if you are a descendant of someone who was in Kenya before 1963, you should be a Kenyan by birth. But in practice, and I think, again, this links to colonialism, and I think this has happened in many other countries, certain ethnicities are considered politically correct and certain ethnicities are considered not. So despite being in the country since that time, certain ethnic groups or tribes have been under suspicion. And like the Nubian community have really had to fight for their rights of citizenship. In terms, I think vetting had been introduced about 30 years ago. The government does say this has to do with border communities. But for most of the time until just a few years ago, the vetting process was actually not in law at all and was a completely illegal process. And so I think the government has introduced it to try to show that they're doing something on these issues. But in reality, the kinds of questions that are asked during vetting is like, do you eat matoke? Where did you go to school? Can you speak Swahili? Let us see your vaccination mark. Have you called Somalia recently? Questions that have nothing to do with your nationality or your right to an identity card. And so we really see, yes, it's important to issue documentation to the right people, but there are many other ways of, doing that properly without running the risk of this kind of discrimination.
And all I can say, I think, is, to sort of summarize is thank you very much to you both for doing the work and highlighting both within Kenya itself by raising the profile and fighting for inclusion, fighting against exclusion, but also for taking the time to share the work that you're doing to help us understand how when we're thinking about identity systems in our own countries, that we can introduce safeguards and processes and systems that can try and not lead to exclusion as well. So we really appreciate the hour that you spent with us today. I've really personally enjoyed the session. I think from the questions that we came in, everyone else was engaged and enjoyed the session too. So it's been really fantastic. And I'm going to also send all of you that joined today, but also Laura and Zara as well, an invitation to our Digital Identity Week in November, because I think this will be a great chance to keep having these conversations.
Thank you for having us, Sarah. It was a great opportunity to present our work to you. We thank you so much.
Thank you very much to everyone. It's been great to interact.
Thank you, and look forward to seeing you all again on a webinar at Digital Identity Week as well. Bye-bye, everyone.